December 14th, 1942. The sands of North Africa stretched endlessly under a pale winter sky. Near the shattered remains of a British supply convoy, a solitary American vehicle sat abandoned, its olive-drab paint already caked with dust. The crew had fled hours earlier when German reconnaissance units overran their position. Standard Wehrmacht procedure was simple: destroy captured equipment or leave it behind. But Hauptmann Ernst Müller, the reconnaissance officer in command, had other ideas. He'd seen enough British and American vehicles to know they were different from anything Germany produced. This one, small and angular, bore markings he didn't recognize. "Get Feldwebel Schneider," he ordered. "I want our best mechanic to examine this before we move out." When Schneider arrived, accompanied by two younger mechanics, they expected another foreign curiosity, perhaps clumsy, certainly inferior to German engineering. What they found instead would shake their understanding of modern warfare. The vehicle was barely larger than a motorcycle with four wheels. A small metal plate on the dashboard read, "Willys MB." The Americans, they'd heard, called it a Jeep. The name meant nothing to them. What mattered was whether it could be used. Schneider approached cautiously, circling the vehicle. Its design seemed almost childishly simple: flat panels, exposed engine, no doors, a fold-down windshield. Everything about it suggested haste, not craftsmanship. And yet, it sat there intact, functional, waiting. "Let's see what we have," Schneider muttered, lifting the hood. What happened next would be discussed in motor pools across the Africa Corps for months to come. The engine compartment wasn't just accessible. It was obvious. Every wire carried a color code. Every component bore a label. Every connection could be reached without specialized tools. In 2 decades of maintaining German vehicles, from Kübelwagens to half-tracks, Schneider had never encountered anything so deliberately simple. "This is remarkable," he said quietly, running his hand along the cylinder head. "Look at this. Everything is marked. Everything is standardized." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Go Devil engine beneath the hood displaced just 134 cubic inches. It produced a modest 60 horsepower. By German standards, particularly compared to the Kübelwagens air-cooled engine, this seemed unimpressive. But as Schneider examined it further, he began to understand something profound. This wasn't about power, it was about philosophy. The Jeep had been designed not for excellence, but for reality, not for perfection, but for production. Every bolt was standard size. Every part appeared identical across the vehicle. There were no custom fittings, no precision-machined components requiring special tools or trained technicians. A farm boy with a wrench could maintain this machine. That simplicity was revolutionary. Schneider called over the younger mechanics. "Start it," he instructed. The engine turned over immediately, settling into a steady idle despite sitting abandoned for hours in the desert heat. One of the mechanics noticed something else. "Feldwebel, look at the fuel tank. It's under the driver's seat." "Madness," someone muttered. But it wasn't madness. It was practicality. The design prioritized low profile and simplicity over theoretical safety concerns. In combat, being shot at mattered more than fire risk from a well-protected fuel tank. When Hauptmann Müller returned with 2 other officers, Schneider gave his assessment. "This vehicle represents something entirely different from our approach. The Americans have built this for mass production and field maintenance." One officer frowned. "Our Kübelwagen is superior. German engineering is the finest in the world." Schneider didn't argue directly. He simply pointed to the transfer case. "One lever engages 4-wheel drive, one simple lever. Our Kübelwagen doesn't have 4-wheel drive at all." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. The Kübelwagen was lighter, more fuel-efficient, and used advanced air-cooling technology, classic hallmarks of German engineering excellence. But in North Africa's deep sand, it had struggled constantly. Drivers knew to avoid certain dunes entirely. They'd watched Kübelwagens bog down in terrain that seemed passable. "Let's test it," Müller ordered. What followed amazed them. The Jeep climbed dunes that stopped Kübelwagens cold, its simple leaf spring suspension, crude-looking compared to German torsion bars, absorbed punishment without complaint. The four-wheel drive system pulled the vehicle through sand that would have trapped their own reconnaissance vehicles. They drove it through riverbeds, over rocks, across terrain no German light vehicle would attempt. They overloaded it with equipment and kept driving. They ran it continuously for 3 days. It never failed. Within a week, word spread through the Africa Corps. Officers from neighboring units came to see the captured American vehicle. Their reactions followed a pattern Schneider had witnessed before. First laughter at its crude appearance, then disbelief as they watched it perform. Finally, silence as they understood the implications. "This isn't just about one vehicle," a supply officer said grimly. "This represents a fundamental difference in thinking. We build for perfection. They build for production. And in total war, that matters more than we want to admit." Reports eventually reached German technical analysts in Berlin. They studied not just the Jeep itself, but the philosophy behind it. Cast components instead of machined parts, standardized bolts that fit everywhere, stamped metal panels that could be produced in factories once making refrigerators. The Americans had mobilized their entire industrial base for war. Germany, still obsessed with craftsmanship and precision, couldn't match that scale, couldn't even comprehend it fully. By early 1943, intelligence reports painted a staggering picture. American industry wasn't just producing vehicles by the thousands, it was producing them by the tens of thousands. Ford's Willow Run plant was rolling out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. And somewhere in America, Jeeps were being built at a rate of nearly 2,000 per week. The Kübelwagen, Germany's equivalent, would total just over 50,000 units for the entire war. The Americans would produce over 640,000 Jeeps. It wasn't an industrial advantage, it was industrial warfare itself, and the Wehrmacht was losing that war before a single shot was fired. The captured Jeep became something of a celebrity in the Africa Corps. Muller's unit used it for reconnaissance missions. Soldiers competed for the chance to drive it. When parts were needed, they scavenged from other captured vehicles. And here was the miracle that drove German mechanics to distraction. The parts always fit. Interchangeability. The concept was so foreign to German logistics that it seemed like magic. A bolt from one Jeep fit another. A carburetor from a different vehicle could be installed in minutes. There were no serial numbers to match, no custom fittings, no precision measurements required. Everything was designed to be replaced quickly, by anyone, anywhere. "They've created a system," Schneider explained to younger mechanics one evening. "Our vehicles are masterpieces. Each one is slightly different, requiring specific parts and skilled hands. The American vehicle is crude by comparison, but they can fix it in the field with basic tools. They can swap parts between vehicles without checking compatibility. They've sacrificed craftsmanship for something more valuable in war." "What's that?" someone asked. "Reliability through simplicity and abundance." By May of 1943, the Africa Corps was finished. 250,000 Axis troops became prisoners in Tunisia, Germany's last stronghold in North Africa. Among them were the mechanics who had studied the Jeep, who had learned its secrets, who had come to grudgingly respect its philosophy. Their education, however, was far from over. In American prison camps, they witnessed abundance that defied everything they'd been taught about warfare. Jeeps, trucks, and tanks stretched in endless rows across the desert. Young American soldiers, many barely 20 years old, maintained fleets of vehicles with casual efficiency. When something broke, they fixed it within hours. When parts were missing, replacements arrived within days. One German mechanic, Schneider, befriended an American sergeant who spoke passable German. The sergeant's name was Miller, and he worked in the motor pool maintaining the very vehicles that had defeated them. "Your Jeep," Schneider said carefully. "How do you produce so many?" Miller shrugged, gesturing at a color-coded wiring diagram pinned to the workshop wall. "We make things simple. See this? Any soldier can follow these instructions. We don't need skilled engineers to maintain every vehicle. We train regular guys to be problem solvers. But the complexity. There is no complexity, Miller interrupted gently. That's the point. Same parts, same systems, same procedures. A mechanic trained on one Jeep can fix any Jeep. Schneider struggled to explain. In Germany, we have precision. Our vehicles are engineered to exact specifications. Sure. And when one breaks down, we repair it with precision tools and trained technicians. Right. And that takes how long? Schneider hesitated. It depends. Sometimes days. Sometimes weeks if parts must be ordered. Miller walked over to a Jeep with a damaged transmission. Watch this. 20 minutes later, using only common tools and a replacement transmission pulled from a stack of spares, the Jeep was running. Miller had simply unbolted the old unit, lifted it out, dropped in the new one, and bolted everything back together. No measurements, no adjustments, no specialized knowledge required. How many Jeeps do you produce? Schneider finally asked. Miller considered. I don't know the exact number. Thousands a week, I think. We've got so many that if one breaks down completely, we just grab another. The broken one goes back to a depot, gets rebuilt, and returns to service. The statement sounded absurd, wasteful even, until Schneider looked around the motor pool and counted over 200 vehicles, more vehicles than an entire German division had possessed, and this was just one American unit among thousands. The mathematics were devastating. If this camp held 200 Jeeps, and there were hundreds of camps, tens of thousands of vehicles sat in North Africa alone. Meanwhile, the entire German army in Africa had possessed perhaps a few thousand light vehicles total. We cannot win this war, Schneider said quietly in German, to himself. Miller, not understanding the words, smiled and offered him a cigarette. It's over for you guys anyway. You're out of Africa. Might as well relax. But Schneider wasn't thinking about relaxation. He was thinking about production numbers, about industrial capacity, about the fundamental difference between building vehicles one at a time with precision versus building them by the thousands with standardized simplicity. Germany had entered the war believing that quality would triumph over quantity, that superior engineering would overcome industrial mass production, that a smaller number of perfectly crafted vehicles would outperform endless waves of crude American machines. The Jeep had proved them catastrophically wrong. The lessons from North Africa rippled through the German military establishment, but understanding came too slowly to change the war's outcome. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, the philosophy embodied in that simple Jeep had evolved into something far more threatening to Germany. It had become the foundation of a mobility doctrine that would systematically dismantle Blitzkrieg itself. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had been Germany's answer to World War I's static trenches. Speed, concentration, surprise. Armoured spearheads driving deep into enemy territory, while infantry mopped up behind. The tactic had crushed Poland in weeks, France in months. It relied on a fundamental assumption that the enemy would be too slow, too disorganized, too inflexible to respond. But by June 6, 1944, that assumption had become Germany's fatal weakness. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, they brought with them an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. Over 5,000 ships, 160,000 troops in the first wave. And, critically, a logistical system built on American mass production philosophy. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was the symbol of that system. On Utah Beach, Jeeps rolled off landing craft within hours of the initial assault. They carried officers to forward positions, ammunition to machine gun nests, wounded soldiers back to aid stations. On Omaha Beach, where German resistance turned the sand red, Jeeps kept coming, wave after wave. When one was destroyed, 3 more replaced it. German defenders had prepared for an invasion. They'd built the Atlantic Wall, concrete fortifications stretching along the French coast. They'd positioned their finest divisions within striking distance. They'd studied amphibious operations and prepared countermeasures. What they hadn't prepared for was the sheer scale of Allied mobility. Feldwebel Schneider, now transferred to a Wehrmacht unit in France after his time as a prisoner, witnessed the invasion's aftermath from a distance. His unit had been held in reserve near Paris, part of Germany's strategic response force. When orders came to move toward Normandy, he expected the kind of rapid redeployment that had characterized German operations in 1940 and 41. Instead, he discovered that Blitzkrieg now belonged to the Americans. The journey that should have taken days stretched into weeks. Allied aircraft controlled the skies, bombing roads and rail lines. German convoys moved only at night, crawling through darkness to avoid fighter bombers. Fuel shortages meant vehicles sat idle for days. When they did move, breakdowns plagued every column. Meanwhile, Allied forces poured inland from Normandy at a pace that seemed impossible. Schneider heard the reports with growing disbelief. American and British units advancing dozens of kilometers per day, supply lines extending from the beaches without breaking, entire divisions sustained by a constant flow of vehicles bringing ammunition, fuel, and food forward. "How are they moving so fast?" a younger officer asked during a briefing. The answer, Schneider knew, sat in the motor pool behind them. Or rather, didn't sit there. Their unit possessed perhaps 30 operational vehicles for a force of 2,000 men. Most were trucks, useful for transport but limited in battlefield mobility. They had 3 Kübelwagens for reconnaissance and liaison. The Americans, from intelligence reports, seemed to have a jeep for every 10 soldiers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics of mobility had become devastating. An American infantry division possessed over 2,000 vehicles of various types. Hundreds of those were jeeps, providing tactical flexibility at every level. Squad leaders could communicate with company commanders in minutes. Forward observers could call for artillery support and have ammunition arrive within the hour. Wounded soldiers reached field hospitals while they could still be saved. German divisions, by contrast, relied heavily on horses. Even elite panzer divisions had thousands of horses hauling supplies. When vehicles broke down, replacements took weeks to arrive. Parts had to be specially ordered, matched to specific vehicle serial numbers. Skilled mechanics were scarce, most having been killed or captured in earlier campaigns. The Blitzkrieg doctrine assumed that rapid movement would paralyze the enemy, that breakthrough units would drive deep before defenses could solidify, that the shocked, immobile opponent would collapse into confusion. But what happened when the opponent was more mobile than you were? Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, provided the answer. General Omar Bradley's forces smashed through German lines south of Saint-Lô, then exploited the gap with a speed that mimicked Blitzkrieg itself. Armoured columns raced through the French countryside. Infantry followed in trucks and jeeps. Supply units kept pace, the famous Red Ball Express convoy running day and night to feed the advancing armies. German forces, attempting to respond, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered. Orders to reinforce one sector arrived after American units had already bypassed it. Counterattacks were planned against positions the Allies had abandoned hours earlier. The Wehrmacht's vaunted operational flexibility, its ability to rapidly concentrate forces, had become impossible. They simply couldn't move fast enough. Schneider's unit finally reached the front lines in early August. What he saw confirmed his worst fears from the prison camp. American vehicles were everywhere. Not just jeeps, though those seemed ubiquitous, but entire fleets of trucks, half-tracks, and tanks. They moved with confidence, often in daylight, because Allied aircraft owned the sky. "We can't match this," he told his commanding officer privately. "They have 10 vehicles for every one of ours. When we destroy one, 2 more appear. Our reinforcements take days to arrive. Theirs arrive in hours." The officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, nodded grimly. "I know. I've seen it before. The Soviets overwhelmed us with 34s. Now the Americans are doing it with mass production. Different machines, same result." "But the jeep?" It's not even their main weapon. It's just a utility vehicle. And yet it enables everything else. Their officers can command from the front because they have mobility. Their logistics work because they can bring supplies forward rapidly. Their wounded survive because evacuation is fast. And we have horses, the officer said bitterly. By mid-August, 50,000 German soldiers were trapped in the Falaise pocket, surrounded by Allied forces moving faster than the Wehrmacht could retreat. The pocket collapsed. Survivors fled eastward, abandoning vehicles, heavy weapons, everything that might slow them down. Schneider escaped with his life but little else. His unit's vehicles, what few remained, were destroyed to prevent capture. He walked for 3 days before finding a German collection point. There, amid the chaos of retreat, he saw something that completed his education. An abandoned American jeep sat beside the road, damaged but not destroyed. German soldiers had tried to start it and failed. Schneider approached, lifted the hood, and within minutes identified the problem: a loose wire. He reconnected it, and the engine started immediately. "Can you drive this?" an officer asked. "Yes." "Then it's yours. Get us to headquarters." For the next month, as Germany's armies retreated across France, Schneider drove that captured jeep. He used it to transport officers, carry messages, evacuate wounded. He maintained it with tools scavenged from abandoned American vehicles. Parts were always available because the Americans had left thousands of vehicles across France as they advanced, many damaged but salvageable. The irony wasn't lost on him. Germany's finest mechanic, trained in precision engineering, was now dependent on American mass production for his survival. Other German soldiers had similar experiences. Wehrmacht units across France operated fleets of captured American vehicles, not by choice but by necessity. Their own logistics had collapsed. German industry, battered by strategic bombing and stretched across multiple fronts, could no longer supply adequate vehicles. The Americans, seemingly, had vehicles to spare. Intelligence reports reaching Berlin painted an apocalyptic picture. American production had reached levels that seemed fantastical. Over 640,000 jeeps built during the war, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of trucks, aircraft numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and all of it built with the same philosophy Schneider had first witnessed in that captured jeep in North Africa. Simplicity, standardization, mass production, interchangeability. German industry had produced approximately 50,000 Kübelwagens, 50,000 precision-engineered vehicles built by skilled craftsmen, against 640,000 jeeps built by factory workers following simple procedures. The mathematics spoke for themselves. For every German light vehicle, the Americans had produced 13, and those 13 could be maintained by anyone, repaired with common tools, kept running under conditions that would have left German vehicles inoperable. Quality hadn't triumphed over quantity. Precision hadn't overcome production. The assumption that superior engineering would prevail had proven catastrophically wrong. Worse, the Americans had learned Blitzkrieg and improved it. They'd taken Germany's doctrine of rapid mobile warfare and supercharged it with industrial capacity Germany couldn't match. The result wasn't just defeat, it was obsolescence. By December of 1944, Germany attempted one final offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble to split Allied armies and recapture the initiative. The attack relied on speed, on breaking through American lines before reinforcements could arrive. Classic Blitzkrieg. It failed within days. American forces, despite initial surprise, responded with a mobility that stopped German advances, cold. Truck convoys brought entire divisions to threatened sectors overnight. Jeeps carried orders that enabled rapid coordination. Even surrounded at Bastogne, American forces held out because their logistics, their mobility, their ability to adapt quickly exceeded anything Germany could achieve. Schneider, still driving his captured jeep, watched the offensive collapse. He was no longer surprised. He'd seen this pattern before. German forces, fuel-starved and road-bound, crawling forward. American forces, fully supplied and highly mobile, responding faster than German commanders could react. The war ended in May of 1945. Germany surrendered, its armies destroyed, its cities in ruins, its industrial base shattered. In the aftermath, as occupying forces administered a broken nation, Schneider found work in a US-run motor pool in occupied Germany. The cities lay destroyed, but everywhere he looked, American vehicles were rebuilding what American bombs had destroyed. Trucks delivered food to prevent starvation. Jeeps carried officials restoring order. Engineers drove vehicles repairing infrastructure. He worked alongside American mechanics again, just as he had in the prison camp. But now there was no war, no urgency, just the quiet work of maintenance and repair. They taught him American methods, not through formal instruction but through daily practice. Color-coded systems, standardized procedures, troubleshooting guides designed for clarity, not expertise. One day, an American officer asked him, through a translator, what Germany should build next. What vehicle design would serve the nation's recovery? Schneider thought carefully before answering. A vehicle smaller than the Jeep, more efficient, yes, but built with the same philosophy. Simplicity, common parts, reliability. Nothing that requires specialized knowledge or precision tools. Everything designed for production, not perfection. The officer nodded, understanding. You learned something. Yes, Schneider replied. We learned that winning modern war requires not the best machine, but the best system. And your Jeep was the system on wheels. The prophecy proved accurate. Within a decade, Volkswagen, once the maker of the Kübelwagen, was producing the Beetle, a car that embodied exactly that philosophy. Simple air-cooled engine, standardized parts, easy maintenance. Built for mass production, not individual craftsmanship. It became one of the most successful vehicles in history, selling over 20 million units, more than any German military vehicle had ever achieved. The lesson had been learned, though at catastrophic cost. By the 1960s, Germany's economic miracle was in full swing. Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, all thrived by combining German precision with American-style mass production. They built vehicles that were both well-engineered and producible at scale, quality and quantity, no longer mutually exclusive. Former Wehrmacht mechanics, including Schneider, worked in these factories. They trained younger generations. They built the cars that made Germany an automotive powerhouse. And sometimes, late in life, they gathered at veterans' meetings and told stories. Not stories of battles or heroics, stories of a vehicle. A simple, crude, utterly revolutionary vehicle. One veteran said at a reunion in the 1970s, "No question, more sophisticated suspension, better fuel efficiency, superior design in many ways." Another nodded, but the Jeep was better for war. Schneider, old now and retired, added quietly, "When I learned they made more Jeeps in a month than we made Kübelwagens in a year, that's when I knew we would lose." Not because their vehicle was superior mechanically, but because they understood something we didn't. "What's that?" someone asked. "That wars are won by systems, not by machines." The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was proof that simplicity multiplied by scale could change history, that mass production, properly organized, could overcome any amount of precision craftsmanship, that in total war, abundance matters more than excellence. He paused, remembering that December day in 1942, when he first lifted the hood of a captured Jeep in the North African desert, when he first saw color-coded wires and standardized parts, when he first understood, though didn't want to admit it, what those simple design choices meant. "We built masterpieces," he continued. "Each vehicle a work of art, engineered to perfection. They built tools, designed for purpose, and purpose won." The room was quiet. These men had lived through Germany's defeat, through occupation and reconstruction, through the long climb back to prosperity. They understood, as perhaps no other generation could, the lesson the Jeep had taught. In the end, the vehicle itself was almost irrelevant. It wasn't particularly fast or powerful. It wasn't comfortable or sophisticated. It was simply adequate, but produced in such overwhelming numbers that adequacy became dominance. 640,000 jeeps against 50,000 Kübelwagens. The ratio told the story. American industrial capacity had multiplied German production by more than 12 to 1, and every single one of those jeeps enabled the mobility that turned Blitzkrieg against its creators. The Germans had invented lightning war. They'd perfected combined arms operations. They'd developed tactical doctrines that revolutionized combat. And then they'd encountered an enemy who could move faster, supply more efficiently, and adapt more quickly because that enemy had built a system where every soldier had the tools to act independently. The Jeep was that tool. Humble, crude, unsophisticated, but everywhere, always available, never too complicated to use or repair. The perfect expression of American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. Blitzkrieg required speed. The Allies achieved greater speed through mass mobility. Blitzkrieg required flexibility. The Allies achieved greater flexibility through standardization. Blitzkrieg required the enemy to be paralyzed. The Allies refused to be paralyzed because they could always move, always respond, always adapt. And the vehicle that enabled all of this, that symbol of American industrial warfare, was nothing more than 4 wheels, a flat hood, and a small metal plate reading Willys MB. For Schneider and the other mechanics who first examined that captured Jeep in the desert, it had become something else. A teacher. A lesson in humility. A reminder that pride in craftsmanship, however justified, could be overcome by something simpler and more powerful. The wisdom of understanding what war actually required, not what engineers wanted to build. The courage to choose adequate mass production over excellent limited production. The foresight to design for maintainability, not sophistication. These were the lessons written into every bolt and wire of that simple vehicle. Lessons purchased with German blood across 2 continents. Lessons that would reshape how the world built machines for decades to come. Because in total war, perfection fails. But practicality endures. And sometimes, victory looks like nothing more than a small utility vehicle, stamped out by the hundreds of thousands, simple enough for anyone to drive and maintain, yet capable of carrying an entire army to triumph. The Jeep didn't win the war alone, but it enabled the mobility that made Allied victory possible. It demonstrated the power of industrial systems over individual excellence. It proved that 640,000 adequate vehicles could accomplish what 50,000 superior vehicles could not. And for the German engineers who captured one in the desert, who studied its simplicity with growing understanding, who drove captured examples as their own logistics collapsed, it taught a lesson they would never forget. Sometimes the crude thing that works beats the masterpiece that doesn't. Sometimes quantity creates its own quality. And sometimes the future belongs not to those who build the best machine, but to those who build the best system for building machines. The Americans had built that system. The Jeep was its proof, and Germany's defeat was its validation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.